overview of Hosea, and this week we're going to jump into chapters 1, 2, and 3. We're going to try to, however we end up today, we're going to try to get through chapters 1 through 3 in the next 2 weeks. And then I'm thinking 4 through 14 in 3 weeks after that, but I had a plan for Amos, and that didn't work out so well, so I don't really know. The time you start digging in, you're like, oh, I got to spend more time on this. So we'll see. So we'll start in chapter 1 today and then see how far we get and finish up through 3 next week. Hosea, we kind of broke out last week kind of in 2 major sections, 1 through 3, chapters 1 through 3, dealing with this story that God calls Hosea to marry Gomer, a wife of whoredom, and have children of whoredom. And basically this was a picture, this object lesson of Gomer and Hosea and his children and the nation of Israel and God, okay? And how Gomer is unfaithful and how the nation of Israel is unfaithful. And that is the basics of chapters 1, 2, and 3. And then this storyline that we see that flows through that. And then we see in 4 through 14, which if you read verse 1 of chapter 4, it says, "Hear the word of the Lord, O children of Israel. For the Lord has a controversy with the inhabitants of the land." So, or a lawsuit or a charge against the inhabitants of the land, which the inhabitants of the land of is the northern 10 tribes. So and he says there is no faithfulness or steadfast love and no knowledge of God in the land. And then in these next chapters, 4 through 14, we kind of see that broke out, how he deals with they have no knowledge, they have no faithfulness, and they have no steadfast love. And we kind of see that through different poems and songs and different collections of that in 4 through 14. Okay? So in chapter 1, we'll just jump right into verse 1. It says, "The word of the Lord came to Hosea, the son of Beeri, in the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah, and in the days of Jeroboam, the son of Joash, king of Israel." Okay, so Jeroboam is the king in the northern tribes. This is Jeroboam the second. Okay, we're going to look at this list here in a second, just to kind of help get an understanding of this time frame. But what do we remember about Jeroboam? I asked this question last week. I asked my wife again the other day, and she didn't remember, and I kind of went, I'm not sure that I'm qualified to teach. But does anybody remember the one thing about King Jeroboam in that time frame? What was happening during that time frame? And maybe it's a question that I don't pinpoint to try to drill down on exactly what I'm looking for. But what was happening in the northern 10 tribes during the time of Jeroboam, when he was king?
Was it prosperity and moral decline?
Thank you. I put that out there just in case so somebody maybe would see that. But during the reign of Jeroboam, if you remember from the book of Amos, and Amos and Hosea were contemporaries. They're overlapping in their time frame, okay? And if you remember from Amos, when Jeroboam reigned, it was a time of prosperity where they got all their land back. They got everything back in that time because they lost land to Syria before Jeroboam. Jeroboam got that land back, and it was a time of prosperity and then the oppression of the poor. And a lot of their prosperity was becoming because they were oppressing the poor. But major moral decay was happening during this time frame. So when you think about this 8th century prophets, these minor prophets like Amos and Isaiah and Hosea, during this time frame when Jeroboam reigned, and Jeroboam reigned for 41 years, so a long period of time. But there was prosperity, but extreme moral decay. And we were approaching this time, you got Jeroboam II, we were approaching this time of 722. This moral decay and this decline was even getting worse up until the Assyrians come in and the exile happens. Okay? So, again, they're overlapping with Amos and Hosea. We just finished Amos, last month, and these two are contemporaries. They prophesied around the same time, and they prophesied to the same people, the northern 10 tribes. Okay? So you have the word of the Lord that came to Hosea, the son of Beeri, in the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah. Okay. So we have 4 kings of Judah that are listed. It ends up with Hezekiah. is the last king, okay? You have one king listed in the northern 10 tribes, which is kind of interesting because this is who he's prophesying to. The northern 10 tribes, he only lists one king. And if you notice, during the time, what's the last king in the southern, the one he lists is Hezekiah in Judah. He starts to reign in 716, okay? So he lists him, Hosea is prophesying during this time of Hezekiah. He starts to reign in 716. Well, the northern kingdom ends in 722. So Hosea was actually prophesying during this whole time from Jeroboam II all the way through till after the Assyrian exile. Does that make sense? Okay, because he's saying this one king Hezekiah, well, he didn't even start to reign until 716. But he only mentions Jeroboam here. Some argue, well, it's kind of maybe the legitimacy of these kings. If you flip to chapter 8, verse 4, where Hosea says, they made kings, but not through me. They set up princes, but I knew it not. With their silver and gold they made idols for their own destruction. So some maybe even argue that there wasn't legitimacy in these kings after, because the reign of Jehu, okay? This is called the Jehu dynasty. These four kings right here. They were all, Jehu was the father of these three sons. Four sons, actually. 4 generations. So some argue that this was, Jehu was anointed. God told a prophet to anoint Jehu as king, and then he said his 4 sons would be on the throne. So some argue this is legitimate, but maybe these kings aren't. But some say, well, why didn't he list Zechariah then? Because Zechariah was one of Jehu's sons. Some say, well, it's only because he reigned for only 6 months. So when you're thinking of the Jehu dynasty at this time, Jeroboam would be the main one, and basically almost the end of it, because Zechariah only reigned 6 months because Shallum assassinated him. Okay? So however that goes, this time frame, though, it goes from about 90 years from the time of all the kings listed there. There's a time frame of 90 years. Obviously didn't prophesy that long, but certainly could have at least been 35. Because the time of Jeroboam is, he reigned probably, the start of his reign probably, with Hosea prophesying would have been about 750. Okay? So he at least reigned from prophesied from 750 to 716. So at least 35 years.
Okay, when you say that, you're saying that he kept saying these things for that long, or when he said this, he was talking about that period of time?
Okay, say that again now? Sorry.
You keep using the phrase, he prophesied from 750 to 7.
He was a prophet that period of time, because
Okay,
he's
so
saying...
For those 35 years, he was prophesied.
Yes. Yes. So these, because chapters 4 through 14, it's not like, oh, this is just all in order, and this is all one sermon he gave. There's all kinds of poems and songs and things that were told to the northern 10 tribes. So that was told, these different things were said. He was prophesying to the northern 10 tribes during that 35 years, at least. Probably a lot say it was 50 years. Okay? Okay. So these are the kings during that time frame. In verse 2, he says, when the Lord first spoke through Hosea, the Lord said to Hosea, go, take yourself a wife of whoredom and have children of whoredom, for the land commits great whoredom by forsaking the Lord. Okay, so God called Hosea to communicate his word through prophetic activity. There was activity that was happening here. Normally, this wasn't the case. God spoke, he told the prophet a word, and he spoke that word. But God's actually telling him, go do something. And he's this object lesson for the nation of Israel of what's going to happen. So he says, Hosea, go get a wife and this wife was sexually promiscuous, or it could have been a prostitute. Either way, she could have been just a known prostitute in the area, or she was just someone that was promiscuous out in the community. It's hard to say. But this was a major thing to call Hosea to do this. If you think about this, in our culture, sometimes we don't think about it as much, but even in our culture, if somebody was going to go marry a prostitute, that would probably be kind of a major thing. As a family, if you thought about your son, and he said, well, yeah, there's this woman, but she was a prostitute. That would be a little challenging for a family if you think about that. So think about what that is being asked of Hosea here. I mean, this is a major thing. And that's in our culture, which is way different than the culture at that time, where this isn't what Israelite women did. This just didn't really happen. So for Hosea to do this, or God call Hosea to do this, is pretty major. It had to create a lot of turmoil within Hosea to even think about doing this. But Hosea was faithful. And Hosea did what God called him to do, to marry a prostitute. Now, when we look at the literal translation of this, do most have ESVs in this room? Who doesn't have an ESV? Everybody has ESV? Okay. All right, so what we read is, go take yourself a wife of whoredom and have children of whoredom. Okay? This is the literal translation. Go take yourself a wife of fornications and children of fornications. It doesn't say have children of fornications. The literal says, go take yourself a wife of fornications and children of fornications. Okay? That's the literal translation. So there's two main views that can happen with this passage. Well, there's three. You can be allegorical. We're not even going to really talk about that. Like I did say last week, Calvin did believe this passage was allegorical, that it didn't actually take place. Hosea didn't go actually marry Gomer. This was an allegory, okay? Because he would say God would not have called Hosea to do this, and we'll talk about that in a second. But I'm not even going to deal with that. I believe this passage is literal. We need to take it as Hosea married Gomer and had children, okay? So we're going to look at these other two views, and it's called the proleptic view, and then the view that we just take it exactly literal for what it said, okay? The proleptic view is basically saying that it's describing an event that is taking place beforehand, okay? So it's this future event. You're treating this future event as something that's already happened. So this commentator says the initial statement in chapters 1, verse 2, can only describe a reinterpretation of the first command after the marriage and family of Hosea was constituted. The original call must have simply been, go take yourself a wife and build a family with her. So he's saying this is what the original thing from God would say, go take yourself a wife and build a family with her. That was the command. He does this, then she is unfaithful, and then she has children that when she's unfaithful. And now he's reinterpreting back, writing down what then happened.
But they're only doing that to justify that God wouldn't ask somebody to go and take over.
Partially. Yeah, that's what I would say. And there is some arguments for this that I will give you. Okay? I'm going to tell you right now, I'm not for that view. Most commentators are, I can tell you that. The majority of commentators fall into this proleptic view, that it happens, now we're going to go tell what happens, and we say, well, it was a wife of whoredom and children of whoredom. They're looking back and writing it down now. Does that make sense? Is everybody tracking with me on that? Whether you agree with it or not, that's a different point, but does everybody understand what I'm saying?
Yes.
Okay. And I can tell you, once we go into this, I'm not going to argue it from that view. We're going to argue it from the literal view. Okay? Let me give you just a couple things reasons why they believe this. Okay? And I'm going to butcher this word. It's in Hebrew. The word for fornication is, I've never even heard it said, so I don't really know. Zenuim, okay? So one commentator says this word zenuim, this word for fornications, this literal word, always refers to betrothed or married women in Scripture. They're trying to say that it always refers to betrothed or married women. So somebody that is committing fornications, it has to be someone that's married. So Gomer had to be married if that's what we're saying about her. She was a wife of fornications. She was married to Hosea. Now she can commit fornication. So now she can go do this. But if Gomer wasn't married, you can't use that word. Okay? So that's one argument. Another commentator says about this, Hosea would scarcely or unlikely have attributed such a command to Yahweh. This was Calvin's understanding. He's like, there's no way Yahweh would give this command for Hosea to go marry Gomer, a prostitute. He wouldn't have done it. Okay? That wasn't Calvin didn't say that, but that was his reason. This is a different commentator. And he says, because this word zona, which I'm probably butchering again, this word zona is the usual term for prostitute. And this word would have been used. So if he wouldn't have said, go take a wife of fornication, he would go take a wife that's a prostitute. So he said he wouldn't have used that word before, that zenuim, for fornications. And he also says, and because marriage to an impure woman would not be in agreement with the imagery of the Old Testament, which depicts Israel as faithful to God at first. So this would be, again, Calvin's kind of understanding, that this marriage to an impure woman would not be consistent with what the Old Testament teaches. And they use some verses, and I'm not even going to go into them really, because I don't understand how they're using them. I'll give you one. Hosea 2, verse 7. Okay? They'll use this verse as saying, this is one of the verses saying, for their view. It says, she shall pursue her lovers, but not overtake them. And she shall seek them, but she shall not find them. Then she will say, I will go and return to my first husband, for it was better for me than now. Okay? This verse is that actually isn't the one that's tied to this argument. Well, it's kind of. So they're saying that Israel, this argument that Israel wasn't impure before God called her. Okay? Not in a sense that once God called her, she was pure. So in this verse, let me read it again. She shall pursue her lovers, but not overtake them, and she shall seek them, but she shall not find them. Then she shall say, I will go and return to my first husband, for it was better for me than now. So Hosea marries Gomer. Okay? She's faithful. Then she becomes unfaithful. Then she looks and says, it's better back then than it is now. I need to go back to my first husband, Hosea, because that's when I was pure, at the beginning. Which I get, that is true, but it doesn't make sense that it doesn't say anything about what it was before she married Hosea. She still could have been a prostitute then, and then she could have got married and been pure, and then down the road then became unfaithful. It doesn't ever say that she was pure beforehand. And in my mind, the consistency in the Old Testament, when you look at it, they say, well, that doesn't, if this is one story is this object lesson for the nation of Israel over here, then they should line up together. Well, what lines up together for me is that, go all the way back to Abraham. And I know it wasn't the nation of Israel yet, but go back to Abraham. What was Abraham? He was an idolater. He worshipped other gods. Yahweh called him. Go to the exile. Go to Egypt. God calls his people out of Egypt. And I know the covenant hasn't been made at Sinai yet, but this specific thing hasn't happened, this covenant with Yahweh at Sinai. But what did they do? God calls them out. They get to Sinai. Moses goes up on the mountain, and they build a golden calf. And they worship this golden calf. So it wasn't like beforehand Yahweh or the nation of Israel is pure. And so in my mind, the literal translation lines up. No different than what is the gospel in our own lives.
Yeah, I was just thinking that it's like each one of us, we're a sinner before, we're called, I mean, blah, 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 but I just
Totally.
feel like getting caught up in, it's not possible for that person to have been a fornicator before. The words that you're talking about, the going back to the Greek and the words they use, that makes sense. I can see how they can pull that. But boy, you're really digging into.
In my mind, this is almost the same argument that people struggle with election, predestination, because they don't want to attribute some things to God. And so they're scared. They don't like that idea, so they go, well, you know what? We got to find a way to make it so God doesn't look like that. And it's this same thing here. I don't think we need to try to protect God, that he's using Hosea as an object lesson in this. Okay?
Which is funny because Calvin obviously did election and predestination, but he takes the allegorical.
Good point. Good point.
Well, and I think you make the point saying that in my mind, we have to be consistent of what is being taught in the Old Testament through the story of Israel and the pictures that are always there. And the consistency is God showing at the end that none are faithful, which is why Christ came. So everything's always pointing to Christ, and everything's always pointing back to Christ from the old to the, and so it seems to.
Right, because it's even the whole sacrificial system that's happening is because people aren't even faithful after, in a sense that these sins have to be covered so God doesn't wipe them out with the nation of Israel. So their sins are covered, ultimately pointing to exactly what you're saying, pointing to Christ, this perfect sacrifice. Okay. So if we take this literal, and we got to think. So I think that's why this literal view is so good, because it is really shocking, and it really shows the grace and mercy of God, because this is the people he chose. This is the people. This is what they looked like before. This is what they look like now. And this is what they still look like. They're still unfaithful. They still need a covering of sin. This is how good God's grace is. And we're going to see that through the book of Hosea. How God pursues the nation. Doesn't mean judgment's not coming. Judgment's going to come in the Assyrian exile. It's going to happen. But I think we see, and I think we'll hopefully see this new covenant in Christ. But when we look at these next few chapters. But, so if we take it literally as a wife of fornication and children of fornication, now what we have is two groups of children. Okay? The first view will say there's only one group of children. The time Hosea and Gomer are married, they have children. Now your ESV translation says this, have children, okay? That isn't the literal. You have to put that in there, okay? In a literal. So now in this literal view, you have two groups of children. So you have a wife of fornication, so she was a prostitute. You have Hosea. He's marrying a wife that was a prostitute. Now he's marrying a wife of children of fornication. So now what he's doing is she has children. He's now adopting those children in. That's the first group. Then we have a second group of children, which we see in the story of Hosea. The three. Are you thinking something?
Well, I am thinking something, because in my mind, I get what you're saying with the ESV, but it doesn't seem that complicated to me for the writer to say and have children. Just saying that they're sharing children does not mean that previously she didn't have children.
Correct.
There's really, right? Am I right in that?
It doesn't mean. But what's happening when that gets plugged in, the proleptic view is saying, well, there's only one group of children.
Right. Okay.
This group is have children.
But they're taking that Greek word and making it be all-encompassing.
Now, here is an argument for this view literal. If you look down to chapter 2, verse 1, say to your brothers, you are my people, and to your sisters you have received mercy. So this is plural. Say to your brothers, say to your sisters. So in this chapter 1, we see there's 3 children. Jezreel is a son. The second child is no mercy, is a daughter. The third child is not my people, is a son. There's a problem now if there's only one group of children and you use the plural with daughters. Does that make sense? So now, what most would argue from the literal view is that what this is saying, say to your brothers, these children, these adopted ones in, are the nation of Israel. This is representing allegorically the nation of Israel. And these 3, this object lesson, are saying to their brothers and sisters, because there's 2 groups. We'll dig more into that verse, but that later. But that is kind of the understanding. Plus, now thinking of this moral understanding that some have trouble with this, like Calvin. Okay, he would say, well, God can't be calling him to do this. If you look in this time, the law was the standard for morality. That's just what it was. They looked to the 5 books of Moses. They looked to the law, right? Okay, so in the law, in Leviticus 21:7, it states that a priest cannot marry a prostitute or a divorced woman. That's what it states. It states in there, 21:7, that a priest can't marry a prostitute or a divorced woman. But a priest has a special holy status compared to everyone else. There's nowhere else in Scripture that it talks about that just a man cannot marry a prostitute or a divorced woman. Actually, in Deuteronomy 24, it actually says that a man can marry a divorced woman. It never talks about a prostitute, but it never says it can't. A man can't marry a prostitute. But it does specifically, those verses are combined, or those 2 things are combined in Leviticus 21, that a priest can't do it. But you look at Deuteronomy 24, it only uses the one, but you can marry a divorced woman. And it never says you can't marry a prostitute. It never says that throughout Scripture.
Okay, can you reform?
Yep. No, do.
Going on this. So the other thing that to me is interesting, now I understand the culture was different in that time and sexual morality looked different than clearly it does in our time. But what is so outrageous about the idea that someone, okay, I understand a prostitute, that's what they would do for a living.
Right.
But don't tell me there were not men that didn't marry women that had been sexually immoral.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, probably that looked different back then compared to maybe today's culture, but I just find that interesting because we say that God could not do that. Well, I get the title's shocking to an extent of like,
Right.
that was like her career or her,
Well, and what's
but-
crazy about it is she was a prostitute, so there was plenty of men sleeping with the prostitute.
Right.
And
There was a
that
lot
was
of
an
sexual
issue.
morality
Yeah,
going
that was
all
going
over
all
the place.
over, yeah.
Yeah.
And so,
It's just
but they struggle with this. But one commentator makes a point, he says, man, but this was an act of divine grace to actually marry this woman that was a prostitute. Because Hosea could have had this perfect life. The American dream, the picket fence, and have the wife, and everything was great, and she was pure and all that. But he didn't. I mean, that's what he could have had. So for him, and this was an act of grace, in a sense, for him to do this, to marry a prostitute. Yes.
Just going back to one thing, so you had said that in, was it Leviticus, where you said that
Yep.
it says that, or instructs them that they can marry a divorced woman?
Yes, in Deuteronomy 24.
Deuteronomy 24, okay, because in Matthew chapter 5, speaking on divorce in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, but I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife except on the ground of sexual immorality makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery.
Yeah, in the New Testament. Yeah.
In the New Testament.
But in Deuteronomy 24, 1-4, that is not the case, because we were in a different culture and a different time, and things did change, because what would happen is, what were you supposed to do if your brother's wife,
Right.
you were supposed to take, well, what if you were married?
Right.
Well, there's some issues there, and there's a lot to dig into. It means that there's some challenges in the Old Testament with that to wrap your mind around are hard sometimes, because it's like, well, but you wouldn't do that today.
Right.
God wouldn't allow that today. So there is some differences that
Yeah.
I don't want to jump in too far, but
No,
yeah,
no,
that's
I
it.
know.
Because there's some challenges that I have with that I look and go, oh man, I don't know what to do with that. I don't know what to do with it.
Yeah. There's more to that.
Right.
In the New Testament.
Yes. So this is a great picture of this marriage and helping Israel see their sin. I mean, because they would have never seen themselves like this. And what a great object lesson to say, yeah, boom, this is you. It's kind of like when Nathan says to David, you're the guy. And it's like, boom, oh, his eyes are wide open. You know, obviously the nation of Israel's eyes don't get wide open because it's too far. They're going into exile. Okay, so verse 3. It says, so he went. We didn't get very far, did we? We got to finish 3 chapters in the 2 weeks. No. Okay, so he went and took Gomer, the daughter of Diblaim, and said, and she conceived and bore him a son. So Hosea is faithful. He enters this legal marriage. We aren't told much about Gomer. There's really nothing said. Some would argue that she's a cult prostitute. Some argue that she's just a prostitute known in the community. It makes sense that she's a cult prostitute just because of the comparison God's trying to make with the nation of Israel. What did Israel do? Think back to Amos. In the temple, in their shrines, what did they do? They worshipped Baal, the fertility god. So they would actually take prostitutes into the shrine. And if you remember, they would lay down on garments taken in pledge. You remember that at the altar? And so they were worshiping this fertility god to help produce, help with their crops and help with their children, and fertility, all those different things. And they were actually having prostitutes in the temple, in the shrine, not the Jerusalem temple, but in their temples, their shrines. And so it almost makes sense that she's probably a cult prostitute, because what a perfect example for the nation of Israel, because that's exactly what they did. But it doesn't say. We really don't know. The point is that they're unfaithful, that she's unfaithful, and that the nation of Israel is unfaithful. That's the overall big picture. But we see this is a legitimate child born to Hosea, because it says, conceived and bore him a son. So this is definitely Hosea's child. Okay? You'll start to see that some will argue that, okay, that the next 2 children aren't his, because it doesn't say to him. If you look in verse 6, it says she conceived again and bore a daughter, but it doesn't say bore him a daughter. Or in verse 8, it says when she had weaned no mercy, she conceived and bore a son. Doesn't say him a son. It could go either way. Some argue that born to him could carry through all 3 children. It's said it once. We do that a lot in our language. There's something that we say up here, and then it carries through on everything, on all, in this case, with all the children born to him, but don't really know. So, legitimate marriage, she conceived and bores a son. And in verse 4 it says, and the Lord said to him, call his name Jezreel, for in just a little while I will punish the house of Jehu for the blood of Jezreel, and I will put an end to the kingdom of the house of Israel. And on that day I will break the bow of Israel in the valley of Jezreel. Okay, so God determines the name. God says this is what you're going to name him, Jezreel, which means God sows. And all it means is, it literally means that like taking seed out of a basket and you're scattering it, you're sowing it, you're throwing it. So Jezreel meaning scattered or sows. He throws like throwing seed. In this book, we see the name Jezreel symbolic throughout this book, okay? There's a symbolic significance throughout the book, which we will see later. But in this verse, it is not symbolic. It is literally talking about the place, the valley of Jezreel, and the events that happened in the valley of Jezreel. Okay? Let me give you just three examples. You know something about the story of Naboth. Okay? Naboth He had a vineyard outside when Ahab reigned. Okay? He had a vineyard. Ahab, this king, his wife was Jezebel, right? Wicked. So Ahab was the king. Ahab wanted this land, this vineyard, because it was right outside his place. And he's like, I want that land for a garden. Well, he went to Naboth, and Naboth said, well, I'm not selling it. It's my family inheritance. I don't want to give it up. He says, well, I'll give you land for it. Well, I don't want to give it up. Well, I'll give you money for it. I don't want to give it up. Ahab, literally, if you read the story, he goes home and pouts.
Right.
It's pretty bad. He goes and pouts, and his wife Jezebel is probably looking at him like, grow up, dude. Figure this out. You're the king. So, but she's upset, and she's like, you know what? Get rid of Naboth. She comes up with this plan to get Naboth, and Naboth gets murdered. And this is in the valley of Jezreel. Okay? So the blood was spilled in the valley of Jezreel. And this is on Ahab, which we'll come back to in a second. Then Jehu slew Joram in the valley of Jezreel. Jehu, okay? Jehu was anointed by a prophet as king. God told him, you're going to be king. You will have 4 generations after you, your sons. And God actually commands him to go take out this dynasty, the Omri dynasty, because this is Ahab's father, Omri, all the way through Joram. They're related. Just like this is the dynasty here. They're related. So unlike, compared to the southern kingdom, they were all related, son all the way down, besides mother Athaliah in there. These weren't that way, okay? This wasn't, these stopped. Like this was a dynasty. So Jehu was anointed king. He says, you need to go, what's the word, justify or not? Avenge the death of what happened here, okay? So he's commanded to go take out everybody. So he slews, in the valley of Jezreel, he slews first this king of Joram. He's done. And then he goes back and he wipes out the whole house of Ahab. And if you remember, he's the one that had Jezebel thrown out the window. And then the dogs licked up her blood, if you remember that. He's the one that had this done because she was part of this dynasty. Because she was married to Ahab. Okay? So that happened at the valley of Jezreel. And then if you look in 2 Kings, this is all in 2 Kings, basically 2 Kings 9 through 11, okay, or in that area. And also, you also see in 2 Kings 10, verse 11, it shows just the massacre of all the rest of Ahab's followers, priests, and friends, okay? So when a Jew heard the word Jezreel, they would think of bloodshed. That's what they would think. They would think of the story of Naboth. They would think of when Jehu kills Joram. They would think of when all the bloodshed of the prophets and the priests and the friends of Ahab, that all happened at the valley of Jezreel. So this name came out, and they would have immediately thought bloodshed. And what does it say? It says, call his name Jezreel, for in just a little while I will punish the house of Jehu for the blood of Jezreel, and I will put an end to the kingdom of the house of Israel. So it seems like there's 2 prophecies that happen here that he's saying is going to happen. First off, he goes, I will punish the house of Jehu for the blood of Jezreel. Which is interesting because I got to tell you, I don't have this figured out. God commands him in 2 Kings, let's flip there real quick. 2 Kings 9. 2 Kings 9, the mid verse of 5, it says, and Jehu said, he's anointed, Jehu said, to which of us all? And he said, to you, O commander. So he arose and went into the house, and the young man poured the oil on his head, saying to him, thus says the Lord. So oil's poured onto Jehu's head. Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, I anoint you king over the people of the Lord, over Israel. And you shall strike down the house of Ahab, your master, so that I may avenge on Jezebel the blood of my servants the prophets, and the blood of all the servants of the Lord. And you remember, Jezebel killed many of the Lord's prophets, right? For the whole house of Ahab shall perish, and I will cut off from Ahab every male, bond or free, in Israel. And I will make the house of Ahab like the house of Jeroboam the son of Nebat. This is the first Jeroboam, not the one we're talking about. And like the house of Baasha, the son of Ahijah. And the dog shall eat Jezebel in the territory of Jezreel, and none shall bury her. Then he opened the door and fled. So God commands Jehu to do this. But now he's saying, there's judgment that I will punish the house of Jehu for the blood of Jezreel. So it seems to be, what most commentators seem to be, and I personally can't see it because I don't know that it really just says in Scripture. But it seems like what he's saying is that Jehu went too far. He went beyond what God called him to do. God called him to take care of this dynasty right here and get rid of them. But he seemed to have gone too far. And now what's going to happen is that I will punish the house of Jehu for the blood of Jezreel. So there must have been a lot more bloodshed than needed to happen in the valley of Jezreel. There must have been more than what God told him to do. Okay? So then what happens is this is going to take place. Jehu and his dynasty, because this is already done. Jehu's already gone. We're talking about being down here with Jeroboam. But this is the Jehu dynasty, which goes all the way to Zechariah. And this prophecy happens soon. It isn't long after Jeroboam. Zechariah, the son of Jeroboam, and on the line of this dynasty, he only lasts 6 months, and Shallum comes in and assassinates him. And it's over. Those 4 sons, the dynasty is gone. So that would be the prophecy fulfilled. Then you have the second prophecy. And I will put an end to the kingdom of the house of Israel. I will put an end to the kingdom of the house of Israel. Some commentators say this is Hebrew parallelism. The house of Jehu is equal to the house of Israel. But most will say the house of Israel talked about in the Old Testament it's always referring to the nation of Israel. So most commentators say this is talking about 2 different prophecies that are happening here. So the ones with Jehu, then the second with the Jehu dynasty, then the second one actually is with the kingdom of the house of Israel. And then he says in verse 5, and on that day I will break the bow of Israel in the valley of Jezreel. So we're going to have to end right here. So he's going to break the bow. So this military might, when you think about the bow, you're thinking of this military might. What's he going to do? He's going to break the bow of Israel in the valley of Jezreel. The one thing that's a little interesting about this is that when the Assyrians come in, because most would argue this is what they're talking about, when the Assyrians come in, this military power, the northern 10 tribes are going to be destroyed and they'll go into exile. That's what's going to happen. But a little bit that's a challenge with this is it's in the valley. He says the valley of Jezreel. And that's north, okay? So in the northern kingdom, you've got Samaria, the capital. And that's where the siege happened with Samaria, or with the Assyrians coming in, at Samaria. And the capital was taken, and they were taken into exile. But the valley of Jezreel is north than that, up by Galilee in that region. In the southern part of Galilee. That's where the valley of Jezreel. And there's really no historical thing talking about a major battle that happened in the valley of Jezreel when the Assyrians came in. But there would have been the impact of the Assyrians coming in, and it certainly would have taken out in that area of the valley of Jezreel also. But there isn't a specific time that's listed in history that says this huge siege happened in this area, and this battle happened, and it was a distinction of the Assyrians coming in. Okay? Because that would have been at Samaria. So it would have been really easy if it just said, broken the bow of Israel in Samaria. Then it would be really simple, because that would totally make sense. But when you're talking about bloodshed, it certainly could be, it would make sense, because the Assyrians coming in, they're wiping them out, in the valley of Jezreel, thinking immediately bloodshed. And they're being taken into exile. okay? But there is plenty of time. It says, one commentator said, where's that at? Well, I don't see it on there. But he says there was the Assyrian king at that time boasted about many battles or many times of taking cities in the region of Galilee. So certainly it could take place. The other thing, just before we're done, is that some take it and say that this valley of Jezreel is just representing the whole northern kingdom. And it's talking about bloodshed. Assyria's going to come in, take them into exile, and it makes sense to use the term the valley of Jezreel, talking about bloodshed. And this is going to happen. They're going to be drug away with fish hooks, right? Just like Amos talks about. Didn't get as far as I wanted to.
It's okay.
So we may have to adjust already and go more than 2 weeks in the first 3 chapters.